That's what we're in, the great battle for who has authority to do stuff. Okay. And there's a couple cases we mentioned about guns, regulating marijuana, and we want to mention the Affordable Care Act. Okay. And we talked about this law in the past, and you don't need to remember all the provisions of it, but these key provisions about what the law could do, and one of the reasons we show them to you is because people think they understand what the Affordable Care Act does, and they don't always understand it. Remember, you can stay in your parents' health insurance until the age of 26. Also, the government would help you pay for your health insurance if your job didn't provide it. Okay. So, like, for example, let's say Kennedy needed health insurance and her job didn't provide her, and then Kennedy gets a quote for a price and it's going to be $200 a month. And the government says, we'll pay 75 of the 200. That's a subsidy. That's just a government payment. Okay. Businesses had to provide health insurance for people. Every plan had to meet certain requirements. And the last thing, this is where people got really upset. If you didn't have health insurance, you would have to pay a fine to the government. All right. And so when this law passes, here's what happens. A group of businesses called the National Federation of Independent Business, that's a really long name, but this group of businesses, they file a lawsuit against the United States government. Okay? And incidentally, in case you're wondering, Sebelius was the name of the government official they named in the suit officially. Right? You don't need to know that, but if you want to know it, that's fine. All right? So this group of businesses file a lawsuit against the government claiming you don't have the ability to create this law because is there anything about health care or health insurance in the Constitution? No. All right? But what's the federal government's argument? It's interstate commerce. They're like, hey, hospitals, health insurance, medical care, that involves economic activity that often transfers between states. This should be under our authority because of the Commerce Clause. And look, this is a really big case for a lot of reasons. The Obama administration didn't want their law thrown out, all right? And they also were curious about how far this Commerce Clause power goes. And on top of that, Republicans are like, hey, we don't think this is that helpful to health insurance anyway, right? And here's the result from this. In this particular case, the Supreme Court rules 5-4 that yes, the federal government does have the authority to make this law, okay? But there was a but. There's always a but, okay? It says, look, the Affordable Care Act is fine. The government definitely has the authority to make this, but not because of the Commerce Clause, right? Their power to make this law comes from tax and spend. The power to tax and spend. And here's why. They said, look, the fact that you're required to have health insurance or pay a fine is similar to a tax. And since the government has the power to tax, then they have the power to create this particular law. Right? And this is important for a couple reasons. One is that the Affordable Care Act is still considered constitutional. The national government has every right to make that law, right? But they also wanted to send a message to Congress, okay? And they said, hey, I know you guys tried to rationalize this under the Commerce Clause, but that has limits. You can't just use that as a catch-all, as a justification for every law that you want to make. You're going to have to come up with better reasons for why you should have authority to make certain laws. Okay? So they sent them a nice message saying, hey, in the future, you better think of another way to justify your actions about what laws you want to make. Right? There are still people who argue today that health insurance should be handled by the states because it's not mentioned in the Constitution. Right? Speaking of state power and state authority, we want to go over this real quickly too. Okay? State government, state authority. States get their powers from the 10th Amendment. Right? They get their powers from the 10th Amendment, which simply says that any powers that aren't given to the national government belong to the states. Except that's the exact text that they use right there. Okay? Powers not delegated to the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved for the states and the people. Right? And so what you've got is this constant battle between the national government and the states about who's really going to get to make laws about stuff. Every time something's not in the Constitution, states are like, hey, we feel like that's our duty, our responsibility. And then the national government's like, yeah, well, interstate commerce. Right? It's like a nice little carte blanche reason to do that. It's like when your parents tell you you can't do something, and what's their classic go-to? because I said so, or I'm the adult. And you're like, that doesn't mean that you're right. And the national government looks in the states and like, because we said so, we're the adults. And it's awful, isn't it, Maggie? Especially when you're a liberal in a conservative family. Okay? Now, the powers that are reserved for the states, we simply just call them reserved powers. State powers or state authority, anything that's a power of the state, we simply refer to it as a reserved power. So on the AP exam, for example, if they're talking about reserved powers, they're talking about things the states have, things specifically for West Virginia or Ohio. Okay. One other type of powers we want to mention, there are a few powers, a scant few, and by that I mean like I can only think of like 5 or 6 that we call concurrent powers. Those are things that both the state and national government can exercise. We call those concurrent powers. They can both do them. Like a classic example is taxation. The state taxes you and so does the national government. And if you've gotten a paycheck before, you know that both of them tax you. It's awful, isn't it? How much of their money do you take, or do they take from you, Riley? It's about a quarter of your paycheck. Trust me, I know. Okay? And what happens is you make more money. They take a bigger chunk out of your paycheck. And then the next thing you know, you're Jeff Bezos and you're still worth billions, but you're like, maybe I could be worth a lot more billions. Right? Oh, don't get me started on taxing. Okay? Now, we'll talk about, we'll have an article tomorrow about state authority in Brutus number 1, but we'll get to that one tomorrow. I want to talk now about other cases and issues that really involve how states look at each other, and 2 cases about same-sex marriage, which, man, people are wrangled about that still. All right? Now, I want to remind you, in the last chapter, we mentioned the full faith and credit clause in the Constitution, and it said that states had to honor what from other states? Birth certificates, marriage certificates, any type of legal document or legal record. Okay? And so, for example, even though your parents might have been married in another state, they come to West Virginia. West Virginia still recognizes that as a legitimate document. You're still married. Right? You're born somewhere else and you're here, it's like, well, you don't stop being a person because of that. Your birth certificate's still valid. Right? Court rulings. When I win my court case against Maggie when she tries to sue me for censoring her, violating her First Amendment free speech, I'm like, nobody wears a Bieber shirt in this room. I know, Bieber fever. Catch it. It's what? Oh, for those of you listening at home, it's terrible. All right. The full faith and credit clause says you have to honor legal documents and legal documents, contracts, and court records from one state to the next. Now, in the early 90s, states started changing in terms of their views on homosexuality. Okay. In the 1990s, states started talking about legalizing same-sex marriage. Okay. And at first, it's just a handful of states, like your really liberal states, like Hawaii, Massachusetts, those states. But then people started getting worried because they said if states legalize same-sex marriage, what does that mean for the really conservative states when a gay couple comes to their state? What will West Virginia have to do in terms of that same-sex marriage certificate? They'll have to respect it. They'll have to recognize them as a married couple. And then the conservative states all of a sudden are like, oh, God, no. All right. So they literally, Congress had to pass a law to deal with this because the states were like, especially the conservative states, were freaking out. All right. And so they passed something called the Defense of Marriage Act. They were like, marriage. What do we do? And here's the provisions of the Defense of Marriage Act, also known as DOMA. I know, sounds imposing. Okay. The first provision, it said states don't have an obligation to honor same-sex marriages from other states if they don't want to. So if your state wanted to authorize or say a same-sex marriage certificate is fine, then that's fine. You could do that. Right? But what do you think most states, especially the conservative states, did? They refused. Okay? West Virginia is like, yeah, we're not recognizing that. And in the 1990s, that wasn't a huge deal because like there were maybe 2 states by the end of 1999 that recognized same-sex marriage. All right? So most people, and like I was telling another class earlier, that you have to realize in context, 20 years ago, people viewed what we would call now like the variety of things that are incorporated in the LGBT community, they looked at that very differently. And so, people were like, well, it's just a few small states, won't be a big deal. But remember, we said policy ideas in states, when they go well, people will, it'll spread to other places. All right. So states didn't have to honor that. Now, the second provision, this is important too. The federal government would recognize marriage as one man and one woman. Right. And that's a big deal too. Why do we care what the federal government recognizes as marriage? What is it? Yeah, but big deal if the federal government says that, like, if you want to marry a woman, like, who cares if what the federal government says? What'd you say, Moses? It's what? Nope, not a bad guess. Is there something connected to marriage, like some type of benefit people get from marriage? Tax breaks, okay? Tax breaks, insurance rights, your inheritance rights, all of those things are connected to marriage. So, for example, like if you're a man and you marry another man, okay, if you're married to them, does your job have to provide health insurance benefits to that spouse? Oh, yeah, definitely. Tax breaks. If the federal government doesn't want to recognize your marriage, they don't have to let you file as a married couple, right? And you're going to get treated differently in a different tax bracket because of that. Okay. So look, this stuff mattered. And ultimately, I know that people used to try to sell people, they were like hashtag love wins. Hashtag there's money involved in this. Okay. And there are issues related to what the LGBT community thought, just equality in general. Sir. That's a great question, and we're going to get that in a minute. Hold that until after we talk about these court cases, because somebody else asked me the same thing. All right. So here's what would happen with DOMA. They were like, "Hey, the federal government won't recognize. Like, even if a state did, they said the federal government's not going to give you any tax breaks." Okay. So these two provisions, and people thought, "Oh, we fixed the marriage problem." All right. Not at all. Okay, because the marriage problem needs a lot of fixing. All right. Two cases that result from this. First one, United States versus Windsor. Okay. There was a nice, kind senior citizen lady named Edith Windsor, and she was a lesbian. All right. And she had been together with a woman for like decades, like 30, 40 years. And they were originally in Canada. They moved to New York, and they got married. Okay. And the state of New York recognized their marriage, even their home nation. I think they got married in Canada and then went to New York. And so both of them recognized the marriage. Okay. So even though they're recognized as being married in the state of New York, who doesn't recognize their marriage? The federal government. Okay. Now, Edith Windsor's spouse dies because she's old, and that's what old people do. All right. Now, this matters because here, inheritance rights matters. For example, if you want to leave any of your stuff to any person, you're more than welcome to do that. Like, let's say that I'm like, hey, I want to leave all my stuff when I die to Katie Losh because I love the Losh family. They're just nice people, right? I'm perfectly, and like, look, my student loans are paid off now, so you're going to get some actual money, okay? So let's say I leave all my stuff to you, and you get, let's say it's all valued at $100,000, okay? And you're like, yay, $100,000. And the government goes, not so fast, Katie. You have to pay taxes on that. There are what are called inheritance taxes, right? However, you don't have to pay inheritance taxes if you are a close relation, including a spouse, all right? So when Edith Windsor dies, though, all right, the federal government says, hey, that woman who died, she wasn't your spouse, which means that everything she left you, guess what you have to do? Pay taxes on it, okay? And well, Edith Windsor goes, how much do I owe? And they're like, calculate, add the one, $375,000. All right, poor Edith Windsor. I'm shocked she didn't die from like, oh gosh, the price. Right? Edith Windsor's like, that's ridiculous. I'm not paying it. Okay? And Edith Windsor files a lawsuit against the United States. Okay? And she says, hey, this provision right here, what the federal government recognizes as marriage, that is unconstitutional. And she said, here's why. All right? She says this violates the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. And I know you're not constitutional little scholars yet, But the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment says that you have to provide equal protection under the law to everybody. All right. So basically, what it's saying is what you do for one citizen, you have to do for everyone. You can't discriminate. All right. And Edith Windsor said, you're treating my marriage differently than you would treat a heterosexual marriage. And I demand equal treatment. I think I'm entitled to it. All right. And the Supreme Court says, you know what, Edith Windsor, you're absolutely right. This does violate the Equal Protection Clause. All right. And they said, look, marriage inherently is up to the states. But whatever a state says about marriage, the federal government has to mirror the same thing. So in your case, Edith Windsor, the state of New York said you're married. We recognize your marriage. So therefore, the federal government will recognize your marriage. Okay? And so Edith Windsor didn't have to pay back her $375,000, right? And they said, look, the federal government, this right here, this part of DOMA, unconstitutional. Whatever a state did at the time, the federal government had to mirror it. So in all states that had same-sex marriages, the federal government would have to recognize those gay couples who were married, right? But in places like West Virginia, where there was no same-sex marriage, the federal government could still ignore those marriages, right? So you solved half the problem here. You still had this part of the law that was an issue. Fast forward 2 years later, right? Our other case, Obergefell versus Hodges, which is just fun to say that name. This one's right next door to us in Ohio. There's a guy by the name of Ken Obergefell, okay? And he and his longtime boyfriend wanted to get married, right? The state of Ohio, however, did not allow same-sex marriage, okay? They refused to allow same-sex marriage, all right? Now, he and his boyfriend could have gone to another state and gotten married there. However, he knew that when they came back to Ohio, what would Ohio refuse to do? They would not accept that because they don't have to honor that. All right. So Obergefell and his fiance, they sued the state of Ohio. Okay. They name one of the government officials, a guy by the last name of Hodges, in the case, but they're essentially suing the state of Ohio. And they said Ohio's violating the Constitution. All right. And he said, here's our argument. Ohio is violating the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, something called the Due Process Clause. And in the Due Process Clause, it says no state can deprive you of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And Obergefell and his attorneys argued that, hey, that term liberty, if a state can't deprive you of liberty, that means they can't deprive you of freedom. And Obergefell said, hey, I should have the freedom to marry whoever I want, whether it be a woman or a man. Okay? Now, here's the thing about this. This doesn't mean that you have liberty to do whatever you want. What it does mean, though, is that if the government wants to prevent you from doing something like marrying another person, they've got to show a good reason why they don't allow that. Okay? Like, for example, I couldn't claim that I have the liberty under the 14th Amendment to go around slapping people in the face. Right? Because does the government have a good interest or a good reason for preventing people from slapping each other in the face? Yes. All right? And so when looking at that case, the Supreme Court has to say, Ohio, do you have any good reason why you shouldn't allow two men or two women to get married? And do you think Ohio had a good reason? They didn't, okay? Not one that would work legally, okay? And so, for example, a lot of people tried to point to tradition, but they're like, well, that's not a good reason, all right? Saying something is not traditional or not even moral, they're like, that doesn't work. Or even if you're offended by it or you think, two men, two women, that's so gross. Well, that's not good enough. The state has to provide a reason as to why two men shouldn't be allowed to marry or two women shouldn't be allowed to marry, right? And the state of Ohio couldn't convince the Supreme Court of that, all right? The Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision says, hey, you know what? Two men or two women, they do have the right to choose. That's part of their liberty because the state can't prove why they shouldn't have the authority or shouldn't have the freedom to do that. And anytime the government wants to pass a law preventing you from something, it's on them to demonstrate why you shouldn't have that freedom. You never have to demonstrate why you should have a freedom. They always have to be the ones to give a reason why you shouldn't have it. And in the Supreme Court's eyes, they're like, hey, you guys can't give a good reason why these two men shouldn't be allowed to get married, right? And so ultimately, that kicks out the other provision of the Defense of Marriage Act. Overnight, every state had to either accept same sex marriage certificates from other states, and they couldn't deny somebody, two men, the right to get married, or two women the right to get married in their state now. All right. This case right here, Obergefell versus Hodges, does that give power to state governments or take power away from them? Takes power away from them, because now what can they no longer do? They can't refuse like a same-sex couple a marriage license. And they're like, hey, states, you can still make laws about marriages. You just can't deny a same-sex couple the right to marry. Okay? But there are other things, like, for example, what are some regulations that states put on marriages? What's there always a requirement to do anything in life? You got to be at least 18. Almost every state has a provision saying if you want to get married, you have to be at least 18. All right. So, for example, if two gay men who were 17 wanted to get married, could they do that? Could the state of West Virginia say we're not allowing it? They could say no. And it's not because of their homosexuality that they're being denied a marriage license. It's because of their age. The same way that you'd get denied one if you were a heterosexual couple. All right. And so people looked at this case and they're like, that kind of takes power away from the states. But the federal government says, yeah, you don't get to deny people rights. Right. Now, what's the danger with that phrase up there in the due process clause and this ruling? No state can deprive life, liberty, or property. What could the term liberty encompass, especially related to marriage? How about this? Can I marry my sister? Why not? Well, yeah, maybe I like incest. What is it? Why? Well, it doesn't matter that it's illegal. If it's a right, don't I have the liberty to do that? Great question. She's like, oh, the genetics, that would be a good reason to prevent that. Do we prevent mentally impaired people from getting married? They could have children who have a high propensity to be mentally impaired as well. We don't prevent that. What if I sign a disclosure? I'll never have children. I just want to marry my sister. It's weird, but what do you think they said about gay people 30 years ago? It's weird. I don't understand it. Well, that's fine. You don't have to understand it. So, am I allowed to marry my sister? Yeah, I guess. You're like, what? All right, how about this? Let's take it from another one of marriage here. Here's something that's an issue. Okay. What about age requirements in general? Are those restrictive on your liberty? They are. How about this? Is there anybody here that knows that at the age of 15, you were responsible enough to drive a car without an adult? Anybody feel like I could have done it? Yeah. And so a lot of you all, I think, are mature enough. Why does the government not allow you that liberty as a 15-year-old to drive? Yes, that's a good point, Katie. Most 15-year-olds aren't. But why does his personal liberty, because remember, if one person's rights are being violated, that matters to us. No, it's not the case. What if we just set up a proficiency test for driving? And as soon as you could meet that proficiency test, doesn't matter your age. So a 14-year-old Rydell maybe could drive appropriately. Riley, what were you going to say? Why would they be more complicated? Yes, but the whole point is, do you believe in liberty? What should you have the freedom to do? Yes, I know. That's why we ask the tough questions. Right? How much liberty should you have? How about this? There are some people I know, like seniors in this senior class, who if they told me, Mr. Scalise, I'm getting married next month, and I would be like, that's wonderful. I trust that you're going to have a good marriage. Right? And there's some people who they could tell me they're getting married next month, and I'd be like, that's a really bad idea, and I don't think you should do it. Right? Should we prevent 17-year-olds from getting married? What is it? Why not? So what? Do you believe in liberty? Should people have the freedom to do something? Does the government discriminate against you because of your age? What is it? They don't have what? Yeah, and you're right. Children have very diminished rights. They don't get the same rights as adults. Is that fair? Oh my gosh, I can't believe this. You're like, no, children need to be restrained. But here's the thing: what happens between, like, for example, Wiley, have you turned 18 yet? All right, when did you turn 18? All right, August the what? So on August 29th to August 30th, did something magic happen? You become an adult, like more mature? Oh, you're like, I'm 18 and I shouldn't have certain, you're like, I can't be trusted. Uh, that's the real question about liberty. How much liberty do you want, and how much do we need to restrain people? All right? Because we look at things like right now and like, oh, who really wants to marry their sister? That's ridiculous. But like I said, 30, 40 years ago, people were like, oh gosh, seriously? Gay people want to get married? That's ridiculous. All right? What if I want to marry two women? No, you can't. It is illegal to be married to more than one person at a time. Now, great question. Hey, I can get a bunch of women to live with me. All right. That doesn't mean they're all married to me. Utah? No, it's not. I'm sure. All right. Yeah. Look, do I have the freedom to do that or not? Well, oh, well, in that case, I will marry just one woman because my gosh, who could handle more than one spouse? Seriously, remembering birth dates, anniversary dates, names, it's going to be difficult. Exactly. I need a secretary for that, but I'm not married to her. All right. Now, Wheeler, you asked a question too. You said, "Hey, what would happen if that, like, if they went back to the old way of doing it, where essentially they kicked that case out? What would happen to all those marriages?" There's no way that they could, like, if somebody got married today and this case got overturned tomorrow, there's no way that they could delegitimize the marriage at that point. I don't think legally, like, it'd be too close to an ex post facto law where you would essentially be punishing people um, for doing something when it was perfectly legal. Does that make sense? Yeah. And right now, I'm like, I don't know if y'all saw this, but two of the justices in this case in Obergefell versus Hodges who voted in the minority with the four, Justice Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas, they were like, yeah, this case should be overturned. And it was wrong, that decision that was made in 2015. And people flipped out because they were like, I can't believe they'd say this. And I'm like, it shouldn't shock you. They voted against the majority in 2015. So right now, though, what you're seeing is conservatives getting more voices on the Supreme Court, and that's why a lot of people think that Amy Coney Barry, who is up for the next seat on the Supreme Court, her nomination matters a lot. Now, I don't think you'll see a change to same-sex marriage. I just don't see it for a number of reasons, but that's why people are concerned about it. Okay, good place for us to stop right there, folks.